Hello and welcome to Example of Play, the home for strategy and tactics gaming. If you haven't subscribed already, now's your chance. Today's video is going to continue my look at Strategic Command War in the Pacific, and I'm circling back to do a little strategy guide video. So we've got the tutorial videos that walk you through all the mechanics, kind of goes through the manual and looks at all the important stuff you need to know. And so I figured I would go back, and each campaign in the game has a strategy guide PDF in the folders that you can find. You just click here. That's the manual. That's the strategy guide. You click that. It gives you the strategy guide for this campaign. So you can read all this for yourself, but I figured I'd make a video just kind of running through it and point out on the map where the different areas are, kind of important stuff to know, because there's a few things that are not going to be apparent from when you just boot up the game and play that are kind of important to know and will help you go through the campaign. So this video, we're going to look at the allies in the primary campaign, the Day of Infamy campaign that does the whole war. And so here we go. All right, so as the allied player, the game starts with the Japanese getting to go first. So as happened historically, they will launch a huge offensive all over the map to open the game, hitting Pearl Harbor really hard, and then launching amphibious invasions all throughout Southeast Asia, landing in the Philippines, in India, or in Burma, all over the place. And so you'll watch all those play out, and then you'll be thinking, okay, what am I going to do now? Because I've got these pretty strong Japanese forces. My forces are all pretty weak. But the Allies start on the back foot but gain momentum over time, whereas the Japanese start off really strong and are going to get weaker over time because they're going to have a harder time replacing their losses. And so as the Allied player, you need to start the game off with trying to hold where you can, retreat where you have to, and get ready for your counteroffensive that'll come later. But one of the first things first we want to need to know about how are we going to win in the end, what are our victory conditions? So we actually come here and see the locations. So there's specific locations that need to be held for victories. To win early, you can play out the clock all the way to the end or just wear down the national morale. But there are specific locations to take to get a victory by certain time points in the game, like when the clock runs out, or to win early. So you can see those here. You can also see those visually on the map. So some locations will have like a little blue star. Those locations have national morale penalties or bonuses depending on who's holding it. And then there are some that have this one has both. So a red star on some locations. These are victory locations that you need to hold to win a victory. But if they have both, then they are a victory location and they affect national morale depending on who holds it. So you can they're listed there, but as you're looking around the map, you can see Tokyo's got a red, Osaka's got a red. So those are obviously important positions to hold whenever you're planning your defenses, your offenses. Honolulu's blue and red. It's hiding underneath there, but you can do that to see it's both. So that gives you kind of a visual clue of where those victory locations are, and then also you can see the list of them there. So now we know the big picture of where the important victory locations are. What are we going to do? How are we going to achieve that total victory? Well, obviously I'm not going to walk you through trying to play through the whole campaign. The game is so big and in a lot of ways open-ended enough that it's not going to play out the same way every time. There's no point in me going too in-depth. So instead, I'm just going to do what the strategy guide does and kind of walk through each of the major areas and kind of some stuff to know about them. A lot of this information you'll get in messages as you're playing the game that pop up at the beginning of the turn, but it's in the strategy guide too. And then we'll just hit on it here just to give you kind of an idea of some of the special things about each area and thoughts as you get started on your campaign. So first, we're going to go down here to Australia. Now, Australia is a major power. If we look up here, when you're playing as the Allies, you control several major powers. So the United States obviously is going to be kind of your primary, but there's the British Empire, there's the Soviet Union, and then China and Communist China separately, and then also Australia down here. Australia, if we're looking at it, doesn't have a ton of units at the start of the game. Really, I think maybe you just have the one kind of special forces unit here that you get to spawn in on the first turn. And then they do control some territory, but you don't really have any units to send out right away. In the Strategic Command games, you do kind of get some free units in different ways over the course of the game. So Australia gets some kind of free defensive units if the Japanese player is aggressive and tries to invade Australia. There's actually several of these major cities along the coast and different areas that will spawn a free like half strength division for a lot of them, and at Sydney even a tank unit will spawn to give you a little bit of free defense if the Japanese player does get aggressive. Now, one thing, and something to think about if you're playing as Japan, if Japan lands 3 units on Australia, that they'll cause a morale hit. So 2,500 points to Australia's national morale, and they're only at 30,000 to start. So that's a pretty good chunk to take out if they manage to land a few units in invasion force on Australia. We can also see there are these special zones. So if the Japanese Navy parks in these red areas, they'll disrupt shipping, reducing some of the effectiveness of these ports, and how many MPPs you're getting and stuff like the supply, stuff like that. One thing you could think about strategically for Australia is if we come in here, looking at the convoy map screen. So Australia has a convoy that's going to India. You can crank this up to 40% of Australia's MPPs, so their production points can be sent to the British Empire in India. So one thing you might think about is, do I want to produce units here in Australia, or do I want to send those points to British India where they can be spent up in India defending there more directly? But of course, you're going to need units down here too to fight through all of the islands to help the U.S. with holding this area till the U.S. forces can come to help push the Japanese out. So that's kind of a big strategic thought there of how you want to spend those points. If we come and look at the purchase screen, so Australia is a major, so it actually has New Zealand and New Guinea under it, but they're very minor on what they can produce. Australia can make some aircraft, some naval units, and a few ground infantry units. So a decent little force, but they're not going to be a huge part of your force as the Allies, but they are going to be, they're going to play a significant role in their region. Next, we'll look at the British Empire. So this represents obviously all the holdings of the British at this point in history. India, Burma, and then through some of these islands here. The Japanese pretty quickly kicked them out of a lot of these places. Hong Kong is almost certainly going to fall in the first turn. Singapore is surrounded, won't last very long. So the British are on the back foot for sure at the start, and have kind of a complex situation here where the Japanese Navy is strong. The British have a few naval units in the area, but they're outnumbered and not really ready for a fight. And then they have this difficult terrain up through Burma to try to hold. However, it does favor the defense, so it becomes an important part of the war that you hold the Japanese here through Burma, because if they get through, they can push on into India, which is something the Japanese tried to do historically. If they could have done it, might have been disastrous, but you have really strong defensive positions here where you got to try to hold them off here for as long as you can with the infantry and other forces available. Now, at the start of the game, like I said, there's not too many units on the board for the Allies at all. You got like a couple of garrisons right here that they're just going to have to hold on for dear life. You do have some American air units in the area that can help a little bit, but not much. You'll start getting some reinforcements. They'll come in from the west, and then you got to decide kind of where you're going to send them. Are you going to send them up here into Burma or down into the Dutch East Indies, where, to hold out through here while the Japanese have strong forces? They got some units here. They got obviously a big force here. One immediate concern, like I said, is going to be the Japanese Navy if they choose to push into this direction. The Bay of Bengal, if the Japanese push 3 naval units in here in this area, it can cause a big national morale hit, so something to think about as a Japanese player as well. If we look up here, British Empire has more morale than Australia, so 73,000, but it could still do 2,500 damage to that just by pushing naval units into the Bay of Bengal. The British do get a lot of naval units coming their way. If we go and look at the production screen here, so we have like these minors. So Canada is included and can produce a fair amount of units, but then the rest are going to be mostly very minor. Most of them will come from the British Empire itself, which can produce a pretty good amount of corps, armies, and air and naval units. And if we look at the production screen at the beginning of the game, we can see all of these things are scheduled, but some of these aren't till like 44, 43, 44. However, some are in 42. So you got some naval units coming for free, plus the other ones you're going to want to build and send that way. And so that's kind of like the big question is, where are you going to focus your efforts as the British Empire? Are you going to, focus on holding here, even maybe pushing the Japanese back? Are you going to focus on naval, pushing in with your naval units to defeat the Japanese Navy? Kind of an interesting, how are you going to spend those resources? If we look at the war map, we talk about Australia can send you some reinforcements, some extra points here, and then to strengthen here versus building stuff in Australia. So something to think about there. One thing is if the Japanese do push into India, something that's going to happen no matter what is that you're going to get some unrest in India as the war goes on, as happened historically. Gandhi and the Quit India movement, all of that stuff is part of the game and can disrupt the war effort. That'll pop up over time. If the Japanese can push in, you might even have Indian like rebellion units popping up to help the Japanese. And so it can be bad if Japan pushes into India. So you got to hold them off, but also you're going to want to be going on the offensive eventually. All right, so now we slide up to look at China. Now, China is interesting in that the war here has already been going on for years before the scenario in the game starts. And so there actually are a lot of Chinese units on the map already. There are corps size units, army size units all along the front here. But there's also a lot of Japanese army units along the map here. And so it's going to be a slog no matter what, because this is mountainous terrain, almost exclusively mountain terrain throughout this huge area where you're fighting. And really the key thing is going to be who controls these roads, because if we turn on supply map, we can see, we got good supply around the cities and along the roads, but you go just a couple hexes off the road and it drops down to like 1 very quick. And so controlling those roads and making sure that there are no gaps that the Japanese can push through is a huge part of your strategy. One thing is that the engineer units, which you might have a hard time finding a place for them as the allies in some parts of this, out on these islands and stuff, since you're mostly going to be on the offensive. But here, the Chinese player gets 1 free engineer unit in March of 42, so pretty quick. And then they can build 1 more there. And so you're going to want those engineer units because they can build these fortifications. So you can really stiffen your defense if you get some fortifications built in key spots to hold these roads and railroads and cities and not let the Japanese push through. China also has a lot of events and complex internal things going on compared to the other nations. So we know that there's nationalist China, which is these kind of blue guys, but then there's also communist China, which are the more orange and red colors up here. And the communist China units are kind of stuck in their little enclaves at the beginning, but throughout the campaign, just as happened historically, you could have flare-ups where you might actually end up some of these units fighting each other or in conflict. And you might also have some partisan activity and some uprisings back here in the back that we'll talk about in a second. So for the Chinese, you have this really big war going on that you need to hold the line, but you also have some internal problems going on, which makes them interesting. So I'll just run through the guide. It talks about these different things. There are warlords, and you can mobilize the warlords to help your war effort and even get you some free units and some extra resources and stuff. But to do that, it requires sending some units back. So you see there's a couple special spots like this one that you need to send a core army or tank unit to go park here in this area to activate the warlord here to get him on your side to get the full benefit here. And then also back here in the Xinjiang area, you need to park a unit at this city where this red mark is, a core army or tank unit. And this is important. You pretty much have to keep somebody back here because it's going to get you some national morale and get you the resources there. But it's also going to prevent some rebellion that could actually damage your morale and resources. So you pretty much have to keep a unit back here, which is, pulling away from the front line, parking it way back here where it's useless, but you really don't have much choice. So you need to just be aware of that back there, especially. And then this spot right here too. The Chinese can receive, as historically, a lot of aid from the US and the British that can help keep the war going until those forces are able to move into the region more significantly. They can send aid to China. If we open the convoy map back up here, so the USSR can send aid to communist China, and then clicked on it. Over time, at some point, you can also, the US can send aid to China. We don't see it on the map here. It turns on later, but you can send a lot of some aid there, but there's also a lot of events. So you can send units like the Flying Tigers. The 14th Air Force can be sent to China to help. You can send headquarters units like General Stilwell can be sent to help here. And then they have kind of some special rules about them of how they're managed. We even see at the beginning of the game, you've got Chenault is already there. We've got the Flying Tigers here. So there are some units that can come and aid that can be sent to help them out over time. But you're going to need all the help you can get to fight. This is like its own war here against the Japanese that you have to win or at least hold them off here. Now, within China, we've mentioned there's communist China. And as you see, they do have some strong units here. But even though you control them, they're actually neutral at the beginning of the game. So like if we select them, we can't move them out of little communist China space here, even though we have some units there. Over time, there'll be events that can happen. Their territory can expand if nationalist China is losing the war. Their national morale gets below 50%. Communist China will start to expand, but eventually they'll enter the war on the side of the Allies, and you'll be able to control their units, especially if the Japanese push up kind of towards the capital here. That will potentially activate them and get them into the war faster, though they'll eventually come on side. But you can control them at the beginning, so you can come in here and you can build a few extra units and that sort of thing. And then if we look, they don't have anything on the production agenda at the start. They do have research, but it's very limited what they can research. So for them, you can pick a few things to focus on while you're waiting. But once they're unleashed, they do have some strong units. But like I said, they're actually neutral at the beginning of the war, so you can't send those units forward until either nationalist China starts losing or the Japanese push up against them. And then, as we mentioned, you can get some resources sent to them. So like the Soviets can send resources to them. And then it's not on here yet, but they can send resources, here. So they can send on to nationalist China to reinforce them up to a certain percentage of their points. So you can kind of filter some points through them to nationalist China, or you can choose not to and keep it in here and build up their strength for later on in the campaign as well. Now going up even further north, so the Soviet Union does have a fair amount of units on the board. You do control them. But like with the communist Chinese, they're neutral at the beginning of the game. So although you control them, you can't actually use any of their units to go on the offensive or declare war on China because the game just doesn't let you, because as historical, the Soviets were focused on fighting the Germans. And so the back here was kind of a secondary thought. They didn't have enough units here to fight the Japanese because although we can't see it, the Japanese have a lot of units here in Manchuria, in this area. And so one thing, probably more important if you're playing as Japanese, is that they have to keep several units in this area to keep the Russians from getting aggressive. So the Japanese player is forced to keep several units covering these cities in this area, because if they don't, then the USSR is at 20% towards the Allies, so they're a long way from joining the war. But if they, and you can't, you might be able to influence them a little bit, but it's going to take a long time to really get them into the war. Though towards the end of the game, it is possible. There's several ways. So if the Japanese are pushed out of Manchuria, or if you just get towards the end, 1945, and the British and Americans are still in the fight, and then it kind of simulates that the war against Germany is winding down. So then the Soviet feelings here, this will start increasing on its own, and it'll jump up, and then they will join the war towards the end, and they'll actually deploy quite a few strong units to different areas. You can look in the strategy guide, it tells you specifically which ones, but They do in 1945 send a lot of units. So if you're the Allied player, you might go with the strategy of just hanging on until then to get some free units to help finish off the Japanese here, and knowing in the back of your mind, some reinforcements are coming that way. But for most of the war, they're not really a direct player. Even though they have units on the map, you can't use them. However, like we said, you can have them send supplies down to help the Chinese, and then you can also spend some time building up some units. So there are they can build 14 army units, 19 core units, but you won't get the points really. You won't have the income to build much of this till much later. So as the Allied player, that is kind of a little backup plan, is that the Soviets will come on and join you eventually, and you'll have access to quite a significant amount of units eventually. But early on, you won't, and you won't be able to use them anyway. But in the meantime, you can do research. You can build up those forces for the end, or find those ways to bring the Soviets into the war faster. Finally, we come to the last major power for the Allies, and we'll say probably the most important. Although all the other ones have their roles to play, you can't really no one can fail anywhere. You need everyone to pull their weight, but the US is going to be your main player for defeating the Japanese. And that's not just because really, it's because they get the most production eventually. At the beginning of the game, you're not getting a lot. Like on this first turn, you have like 60 points to work with, and a lot of your resources are low, and they'll slowly build over the first few turns. But eventually, you'll be getting tons of MPPs as the US, and you'll have a lot of stuff to build. But that's the thing. You're going to be building up a huge force to go and fight. You're going to need to be researching a lot of stuff. So something to think about researching early is focusing on like production technology and industrial technology. They're actually already being under research at the beginning, but you'll want to push those up, because every level you get here makes your units cheaper, and then here increases your mobilization, so it gets you more points every turn, which you're going to need. And one thing I kind of talked about generally before, but you'll want to keep your max research, like you're at 2590 here out of 3000 possible. So you're investing a lot here at the beginning, but especially as every nation, but especially the US, you'll want to be researching at your max all the time, so that as the war goes on, your forces are getting bigger and better and stronger. If we look at the board here, the US also controls the Philippines, which can't really produce anything until later. But at the beginning, you've got a lot of naval units on the board, but these are coming in over the next couple years. So you do have a lot of naval units coming, but you're going to need to be building up your land forces. You're going to need to build even more naval units, and you're going to need to this is going to be the bulk of your forces for defeating the Japanese. Now, over the first few turns, obviously, you need to build those units. That's going to take some time. Your US units are going to spawn in over here, and you're going to have to move them all the way across. So it's going to be a while before the US is starting to send units in force across the map. But you will get a few free units. You'll get over the first few turns, a couple units will pop up for different places through here that can be kind of forward deployed. And if the Japanese happen to take like their deployment location, they have alternate spots, so you'll get those units. But like a tank, a corps, a marine division, those things, a few units like that will pop up over the first few turns. So you'll have a few forces to work with. And then obviously some will pop up here at Hawaii. You have a few naval units hanging around here at the beginning. So good for the US to remember, you can zoom all the way out to see like the unit where the units are. There's these stars are each unit, so you don't get your guys lost out here in the big Pacific Ocean. Something to think about as happened historically is you're going to need to do like the island hopping campaign. If we watch some other tutorial videos, naval units are very dependent on supply, as every time they fight, they lose some of the supply. If you use the naval crews to move faster, that uses up your supply. So as your naval units run out of supply, they become useless. So to counter that, you're going to need to capture ports. So like Hawaii this is your supply you're getting here, but as soon as you go away from it, now you're not getting supply. So you'll need to think about, all right, where am I going to capture ports as I go across here? Now we do control some to start with, but the Japanese are going to be attacking some of these and taking them, so we'll need to take them back. and we'll need to have somewhere for our ships to arrive at, to resupply, and then push on to the next location. That's going to need to be a big part of your strategy. You'll also want to think about how you're going to fight the Japanese Navy directly. Besides taking these bases and having your strategy moving forward, you still have to fight the Japanese Navy, which at the beginning is strong. And although the U.S. has a few carriers available, you've got the Saratoga and the Enterprise on the map in turn one. You can deploy them, and then you get another pretty quickly. But then after that, it's going to take a while. You're going to have to build them. As we talked about, building carriers and battleships takes a long time. And so you're going to need to start building those early for them to show up later on. And so you want to make sure you don't lose any of them. As you know, if you know your history of the Pacific War, losing some carriers, losing a big naval battle can swing the war dramatically. And so you want to pick your fights carefully. You'll want to think about scouting and not exposing your carriers to the enemy until you think you got a good shot at doing some serious damage. You'll also want to do research and get your naval weaponry up and naval warfare up, and that'll make your naval units stronger. But as you might know from watching other videos, you can't upgrade those units unless they're at port. So unlike the land units that you can just upgrade them wherever they are, your ships will have to come back to a port to get upgraded. So that's, again, the importance of taking those ports and having bases of operation for your fleet. And another thing to think about is, do you want to focus on building submarine force up? So for like that, at the beginning, you can only build a couple submarines and they're not very good, as was historical with the torpedo issues. You can do several researches. Advanced subs can go up 5 levels. Submarine warfare can go up 5 levels. Increasing, if you research submarine warfare, that lets you build more subs, 1 per every level you go up. And so that really, for the US, it's kind of the biggest scope of choice in terms of what areas you want to focus on, because you need good infantry units, you need good aircraft, you need a strong navy, you need logistics and production. But the flip side of it is you'll get a lot of MPP, so you'll have a ton of points to spend. It's just how you want to focus those points, how you want to project them out, because building like those carriers and battleships and stuff takes a long time. And then you'll want to have done the research to make them strong. And then you'll want like the submarines and the aircraft and then the land units to land to take the ground once you push out there. So kind of a lot to think about early on, like how do you want to plan out your naval strategy, because that's going to be a big part of your overall campaign. Another thing you can spend those points on is supporting China, supporting your allies, like we already kind of talked about, but you'll get options to send these convoys. They're not all here at the beginning, but eventually you'll get options to send aid. There'll be events that pop up to let you send units to help China, help other areas. So that's usually most of those events. Typically you're going to want to do whatever the historical thing was, which if you don't know, when those pop up, it'll give you like a little note of like what happened historically and then what will happen if you say yes or no. And so they're always there as kind of fun choices. Sometimes there's like fun what ifs in the strategic command games, but typically you're going to go with the historical choice unless you've got an idea that you want to alter it for some reason. One of the fun events that you can do right off the bat is the Doolittle raid. So you see all these little US markers here. You need to get to launch Doolittle's bombers. You need to get a carrier to this ring around Japan, which is actually not that hard to do since you have a couple carriers right off the bat, but you want to keep them safe, especially if you're playing against a human Japanese player. They might be anticipating that you're going to do this and be watching for your carrier, so you want to be careful. Against the AI, it's not too hard, but you still want to be careful that you don't lose one of your carriers right off the bat. But you can, in a few turns, you can get these carriers across the map, and then you just need to get them to here, and then the Doolittle raid will happen automatically. Gives you a nice morale boost while knocking Japan's morale down a nice chunk. So that's something that you'll probably want to do. But that's, if you're wondering what all these little markers are for, that's what that's for. That's an important early game event that you'll almost certainly want to do that. So that's all the major nations. Now there are also actually quite a few minor nations on the map here between all these small nations throughout Asia. I'm not going to talk about every single one because some of them ultimately for all the purposes of this campaign, they're not super important. They are there historically. and are part of the game, but you know, like Mexico is on the map, but they don't matter. They can't play any role in the game, so we don't really worry about them. If we come to our diplomacy screen, we can see that there's like Afghanistan's on the map. I don't know if it's even possible to bring them on board or if anything happens if you do. But there are a few that are important, so we'll kind of mention those. First one is Burma. So I kind of already mentioned this, but this is a very, very important part of the map to defend against the Japanese. Burma actually has a few units that it'll spawn on its own to help defend, but they're not that going to be that great. They can't hold the Japanese back by themselves. There are the oil field here. There's another one here. So holding this area just for resource wise is important. The Burma road is here. If that gets cut off, then and Burma falls, then the allies, the US can't send resources to Japan or to China as effectively. They have to fly it over versus sending it by land, so it's much reduced. And so holding Burma is, really critical to your campaign. On the other side of the map, Canada, they're kind of the outlier in the British Empire. They're way over here, but they can build a decent amount of units. So a fairly substantial ground force can be built up with a headquarters, some corps and armies, some aircraft, and a couple naval units, including they can build 4 destroyers. So they can be helpful for escorting the U.S. forces going across the ocean in defending up in here in the northern part of the map. So don't forget about Canada up there. Probably the largest minor nation maybe is the Dutch East Indies. So all through here is the Dutch East Indies. They actually start the game neutral. You don't control them. They're not at war with Japan, but Japan will almost certainly attack them and draw them into the war, bringing them on your side. But really, for the Japanese, they kind of have to because there's all these oil fields. So there, 2 of them right here. For the Japanese player, they got to take all these oil fields to get all those resource points, because otherwise, they're going to be lean on resource points. But if they take all of those and are able to hold them, those are all worth a fair amount of MPPs per turn. And so that is critical for the Japanese to take those, and for the Allies to try to defend them and take them back if they can. But once the Japanese attack, then the Dutch East Indies will enter the war and have some units that can fight. One that's small, but I gotta mention because they're so cool. We love them. Nepal up here is well within the confines of India. If they get attacked directly, things are probably going bad for the allied player. But don't forget to come down here and check on them, because they can build 2 corps, and these represent the Gurkha units as part of the British Empire. They're not any different than a regular corps, but it is kind of cool to think that's what they represent. So you want to make sure, don't forget to, because a lot of these miners have like Malaya can build 1 corps, the Free French can build 1 garrison. It's not too exciting, but Nepal can throw in 2 corps for you. So make sure you come down here and build those guys at some point. The Philippines, I'll mention just because there's some early events tied to them. So, as went historically, it's very hard for the allied player to defend here. They got a few units. You've got a fortified place here at Corregidor, but it's going to be really hard to defend because Japan is just right there, and all your friendly forces are far away. Once the Philippines fall, MacArthur will move and will appear as a unit in Australia, so he'll become available, but you'll take a big national morale hit for the US when the Philippines surrender. And as you know, later on, you'll need to take it back. And this is actually a pretty big, there's a lot of ports and settlements and cities on the map here in Airfield. So, and this is a victory point and national morale point here at Manila. So important location. There's not much you can do about it to defend it early on just because of the situation, but a lot of important stuff tied to the Philippines. And then I come down here and look at the Solomon Islands and the islands down through here, because they have a lot of special locations with these red stripes. So if you hover over it, it kind of tells you what it does. But like Guadalcanal, this represents the slot, which is historically where a lot of fighting went on, naval fighting. So if you can park ships here, you block off supplies to Guadalcanal. If you can, the Japanese can put bombers on a lot of these locations. They can raid the supplies going to Australia, and so that applies to a lot of these islands down through here. So if the Japanese hold some of these, It hinders supplies to Australia from the US. And you can see also these blue stars. These are a lot of national morale hits. So if the Japanese can take those two, and then Guadalcanal is also one. So taking those locations causes some national morale bonuses and hits if the Japanese player is able to get a hold of those. So important to try to defend them when you can, take them back later if you can't hold them early on. And then finally, I'll mention Tibet. So they won't play a role like militarily so much, but you can actually do diplomacy on Tibet to try to bring them over to the Allied side. And if you can control them, it lets you send more supplies through to China by land route, or like if Burma gets cut off, that gives you an alternate way to send supplies to China. So something to think about if you got some extra points to spend on diplomacy with Tibet, trying to bring them on side could be helpful in the big scheme of things. All right, so I think that is probably long enough for this video. There are more things I could talk about. There's more minor nations through here that have a few little important things to them, but really I think we've hit the bigger ones. And then, you know, obviously controlling all these places through here. There's ports. That's going to be part of your strategy, taking that from Japan, or as a Japanese player, taking those. Every location has some kind of importance if it plays a role in your strategy. You don't want to like just take one of these islands for no reason. You want it to be because it's the next step in your strategy of eventually getting to Japan. As the historical strategy went, that's probably going to be your winning strategy here too. And like I said, there's not really like one right way to play this campaign and win. You know, usually in these games, kind of go in the historical route is a good place to start, and then depending on how the campaign goes, you know, deviate from there or put your own spin on it. Try something different if you want to. But I'm not going to try to tell you exactly how to win the game. My goal here was just to kind of highlight a lot of important things. These are things that are, like I said, they're in the strategy guide. They're things to think about, events, and some of it's not obvious when you just fire up the game. There's nothing that tells you like, hey, what do these blue stars mean, unless you go look in the manual. So I figured that's important to cover stuff like that. And then important things about the different nations and different spots on the map to kind of understand, so you're not blindsided by some event popping up. There are tons of, they're called decision events, things that'll pop up and say, hey, do you want to spend some resources to do this or that? If you look in the strategy guide, it lists them all out, but there's like dozens and dozens of them. So it adds some flavor to the campaign over time. If you know your history, you'll kind of know some of them are going to pop up before they do. But some are like alternate history, plausible things that maybe could have happened, or you can choose to not do the historical thing. And, you know, sometimes it lets you save resources or lets you send units to place B instead of A, that sort of thing. So I hope, but overall, I hope you got something useful out of this video. If you're kind of looking for, you watch the other videos, you know the mechanics, but you're looking at this big map, you've got all these units spread all across this huge area, and you're thinking, you know, where do I start? I hope this was kind of useful to give you some starting points and kind of how to get the framework of your strategy going to go and fight and win the war in the Pacific. I'll do one more video about this from the Axis side, so Japan's point of view on it, which will be the basics are similar, but of course everything's flipped around, and then the Japanese have their own considerations unique to their situation. So look forward to that next video. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and thanks for watching.